Hello and welcome to SpyHards podcast. I am Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
And we're heading back to 1990s, the Russia House, with another SpyMaster interview. Cam, who do we have joining us?
Yes, we are talking to director Fred Schepisi, who, in addition to directing The Russia House, also helmed movies like 6 Degrees of Separation, Roxanne, and Cry in the Dark.
And usually we would have dropped this the same week as our review of the Russia House, and we of course had our chat with the cinematographer of the film, Mr. Ian Baker, but this one came together very last minute. We're literally recording this on the night that the Russia House review drops, so we thought we'll get it out to you as quick as we can the following week. So without further ado, Cam, roll the interview. And joining us now on the show, the director of the Russia House is Mr. Fred Schepisi. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm very good this morning. The sun's out.
Wow. I can't say the same for here, but it looks like very sunny where you and Cam both are right now. So I can't blame the smile on your face. Now, we've been talking about your film, The Russia House, recently, but I think before we get there, I just want to quickly talk about the sort of you getting started in the film industry and sort of what inspired you to become a director in the first place.
Oh, that's quite complicated, but I'll try and keep it short. I sort of, in year 10 at school, I went into a monastery.
Right.
And I lasted about 18 months there. It's what was called a juniorate. I was training to become a teaching monk, or brother, they call it here, for the Morris brothers. Then I decided perhaps that wasn't really going to be for me. And I came out, had no idea really what I wanted to do. I started to work my dad had used car yards at the time, and I started to work in one of those, and he pretty soon found out I was useless at that. And my mum had ideas that, because I was good at English, maybe I could be a journalist or a novelist or something like that. And somebody said, you can make good money in advertising if you're good at English. So I went to a vocational guidance person. He asked me, I had just turned 15 at that point, and he asked me if I wanted the long test or the short test to see if I was any good for advertising. I said, I'll do the short test. Thanks. So he showed me 3 colours. I got them right. And he rang up someone he knew in advertising and got me a job in the dispatch department. So I went there, and it was a lot of fun, and I was training in lots of different things. And early on I was training in doing typography and getting stuff ready for print. And television came in to Australia at that point, and because of my interest, I was going to see what we used to call continental films, not necessarily for the right reasons. And I just found wonderful worlds opening up, and strange things about places I didn't know, and always managed to find myself in it, which is when a film's really good. And I realized that's something I'd like to do. So I used commercials and things to do a lot of practice, because nobody knew what they were doing in those days in that regard. So I was learning about lenses and lighting and stuff by doing commercials. I was exposed to a few film societies and film festivals here, which we had very early on. And I knew sort of within a few years that really I should be out in that world, not advertising, because I wasn't enjoying advertising that much. So, and that's really how it came about. it took a long time after that, by the way, before I got. I made a lot of commercials. I made about 1,000 commercials, and I made a lot of industrial documentaries, public relations films, some small TV things, little things, like how to do this, how to do that. And I was using all of those to, just to practice, basically.
It's actually surprising the amount of directors we've spoken to that actually started in advertising and working in sort of ad work. I remember Jeremiah Chechik, I think one of your contemporaries, around sort of the time the Russia House came out, had the exact same genesis, but did it in Europe as opposed to in Australia.
Right, right.
And just sort of running aside from becoming a director and getting that foot in the door of Hollywood, obviously on the show we talk about spy movies every week. Were you aware of spy movies? Were you a fan of spy movies growing up, and anything you particularly drifted towards?
Not specifically. No, I was much more interested in films from Europe, films from Iran, films from India, films from Russia. They were the ones that were out there experimenting, doing things. Then, then the English had a new wave, and so within that there would have been a few spy films that were really good. The interesting thing about spy films was they always allowed for surprising use of technique. Always there's one with Michael Caine that always comes to mind. I can't remember the name of it at the minute, but they were shooting through parking meters, shooting through side view mirrors of cars, reflections in windows.
Was it the Ipcris file?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Classic.
That's a classic and a great example of because it wasn't just gimmicks, it was because it was a spy film. You could play around and keep surprising and use techniques, which I can elaborate on a little bit about Russia House. But so because a lot of times when you're making films, you've got to bury many of the things that you can do with technique, because the film dictates really what you can do. You don't want to just posing razzle dazzle on a subject that doesn't require it. It just becomes distracting. But you get to a spy film, you can have a lot of fun in that regard.
Well, let's use that as a jumping off point. Let's talk about the Russia House. Now, it comes out in 1990, but I guess leading up to that, obviously pre-production stuff like that. But how did the Russia House come to you? How did you learn about the script and get involved in the project?
I have a great agent, or had a great agent, called Sam Cohen, who represented probably all of the top directors in America at that time. And that was from Woody Allen to Sidney Lumet to I'm going to forget all the names now, but Robert Altman. They were all with Sam, and John le Carré became Sam's client for a while, and Sam sort of connected me up to le Carré and then to Tom Stoppard, who wrote the script. A little bit of nudging from me here and there. It was actually one of those things that came together like that, because Alan Ladd was at MGM at the time, and Sam Cohen and he had a great relationship. Alan Ladd said, "Yeah, well, if you get Sean Connery and we'll green light it." So we sent Sean Connery the script, He was coming from one country going to another one, that he had an airline changeover somewhere in Europe. So I flew to meet him. He was going to read it on the plane. I flew to meet him at his changeover. And we sat in the lounge in the airport and talked about it. And he said, "Okay, laddie, I'm doing it." And from that point on, we went to Cannes. I think it must have been with Fry in the Dark. Anyway, we went to Cannes, met a delegation from Russia, because at that time, things were pretty grim in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
A guy who distributed my film in Russia, my film Devil's Playground, he distributed that in Russia, and he put us onto the head of the Cinematographers Society, which actually is actually one of the controlling bodies of making films over there. And then that's who we ended up meeting in Russia, and we did a deal, and within a couple of months we were in Russia doing pre-production, just as Russia was completely changing, getting rid of all the countries that was costing them money at the time, Hungary and Poland and all those places. That was happening while we were there.
Was there ever any consideration about shooting somewhere other than Russia?
Not with me.
No, yeah, I just was curious, just because of the logistics, if there was ever kind of like a backup plan, or if it was like, no, it's got to be Russia.
A lot of people do it in Finland and other places, yes. Up until that point, most of that was there. But no, I thought it was a great opportunity to, well, you can see it in the film, some of the places, like the city of churches, Zagorsk. Mm-hmm. Nobody had ever filmed there before.
Mm.
We were so disruptive. No one will ever film there again.
Hey, you got your film. That's all that matters.
Well, it wasn't that so much. It was, I don't think they understood, it's a religious enclave, so I don't think they understood the full impact of a movie crew coming, and disturbing their spiritual calm, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Le Carré earlier on when you got connected with him. Were you aware of Le Carré's work at all? Had you read any of his novels at that point?
Sure, and seen a few of the films, a lot of which were actually on television, which was ideal for his work, because there's a lot of nuances and a lot of threads running through, and if you can do that over a 4, 5, 6-part series, you can do it real justice.
Mm-hmm.
The toughest thing for us was to do it in the 2-hour period.
Right. And like, what were the tougher battles in terms of kind of working with the screenwriter to make that happen?
I sat down and did a graph of how the movie might go. I know that sounds weird, but there's so many threads going on. Mm-hmm. You needed to know, well, how do we do this? How do we do it in the time at our disposal? So I had that kind of plan originally, and then interestingly enough, when I sat down with Tom, he'd already done something exactly the same, so that we knew that at least we were both going along on the same lines, so it wasn't difficult. A lot of conferring with John le Carré, and a lot of conferring between us. I think when we did the first couple of passes, MGM at the time were not all that thrilled with the amount of dialogue and stuff. For them it was like an action picture. So we had a really strange moment where they flew over to London to harangue me about it. Tom had gone off on holidays, so I said, "Well, let me attack it." And there were some things in the novel that I liked, and I think John le Carré liked. I wanted to extract from the novel, so I sat down. One of my daughters, Ashley, was my assistant at the time, and I'd run a number of. I marked the book up, and I had her sitting next to me. All right, go to the next section, tell me what that is, and we just tried to visually express things with less dialogue, but also put in some more complexity. And we were sending the pages to the guys at the hotel, and up until 5 a.m, they were staying up, and I was pumping pages over to them, and eventually we got the proper green light. And then when Tom came back from holiday, I handed him the mess and said, "Here, you better fix this."
You mentioned Sean and him getting involved pretty early on, just with having the sort of connections. But the cast is not just Sean, of course. There's a lot of great names in there, just namely Michelle Pfeiffer, like the cusp of superstardom, basically.
Yeah, look, we knew we had to populate it
Mm-hmm.
with really good actors and really good names. I had a Russian woman who I thought would have been fantastic for the part, Maria Andreychenko. She was beautiful. She was extremely talented, and but you could tell that the studio were not exactly thrilled by that at the time.
Mm.
And I spoke to, I think it was Stephen Frears, I was talking about it because he'd been in similar situations. And he said, "Do you want to make a film or do you want to make a movie?" And I thought, I better make a movie this time.
Mm.
So, and I had a lot of faith in Michelle because I'd observed in some of the things that she'd done that she had a lot going on in terms of acting, and it turns out that she had a minor bird's ability to do accents and stuff. So we went down that path.
One of the things I thought was really interesting watching Russia House was that I struggle to imagine that movie being made now. It's just, it is a hard espionage film, right? And you're doing it with major stars. It's not the type of thing that would typically, I feel like, get a green light these days.
Mm.
Was getting these stars, whether it is Michelle Pfeiffer, Sean Connery, or Roy Scheider, down the list, like, were they essential in basically getting the studio to say, we will make this movie? Because the material, I don't know that it would have been easy even then to sell that in a marketplace just off the material.
That's correct. However,
Yeah.
Alan Ladd and Jay Cantor and um, what's his? There's another guy as well. They had good taste and they were prepared to take those chances. But you did have to have that standard of star to get it made for sure. But weirdly enough, everything coalesced to make it easy. Frankly, it was all done within a couple of weeks. I mean, once you get Sean, you're going to get other people who want to do it as well.
Mm.
I think the excitement of going to very strange locations attracted people. It came to serendipity. Like some projects have serendipity and they just come together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's littered with, great names from, Roy Scheider, John Mahoney, James Fox, Klaus Maria Brandau. But there's one name that stood out to Cam and I when we were reviewing it, and that's Ken Russell.
Yeah.
How did Ken Russell get involved with this film?
Well, we needed somebody eccentric. Look eccentric, and we just needed another name, and it wasn't that huge a part, So, and yeah, I liked him, so I just thought that was what you call it, not gimmick casting. There's another name for it, but anyway, yeah, and he was pretty funny because he used to. There's one scene, if you ever look at it again, there's one scene where they're all sitting around talking, and Ken keeps putting all the SpyMasters, Ken keeps putting his feet up on the table or feet up on the edge of the couch, and he would wear on one leg he'd have a bright yellow sock, on another leg he'd have a bright red sock, and then he would change it for a couple of. He was taking the Mickey really, and I looked at him one day and I said, because I didn't mention it to him at all. And he was trying even harder and harder. And I said, Ken, if they're looking at your socks, we're screwed. So he stopped.
It's very fitting you mention Ken Russell, working on the movie, but also you started this interview referencing the Ipcris file, and Ken Russell directed the third entry in that franchise. So it's very fortuitous, yeah.
True.
I wanted to, because we've spoken to Ian Baker, who of course worked with you on this film as a cinematographer. And one question I sort of have for him, and I'll throw it to you too, is how did you go about sort of capturing the essence of Russia? You're shooting in Russia, as you say, but somehow, for us at least, you actually managed to portray the character of Russia, that more than just it being a place, and it's something that really is felt throughout the film.
Yeah, well, that's the thing I like to do. Like, I have this feeling that where you're doing something is as important as what you're doing. It gives depth to your film, it gives veracity to it, and it just makes it a lot richer. I like to have a lot more going on in the film than is just going on the surface. You've got to have that front force, but you've got to have other substantial things supporting that, and it sort of works really well if anybody ever wants to see it again. I like doing that. The writing, one of the strengths of Le Carré's book, which made it a lot more than just a spy film, is what he writes about and why he writes. He used spy novels as the house in which he told stories. He used what happened as the furniture that was being moved around. That's how he described it. He was really making films about the what's going on in a particular country, in a particular lifestyle. And that's what just makes it a much more interesting, solid film. I've got to tell you a story.
Yeah.
One day we were shooting in a control room where the spies are all, Roy's featured and James Fox are featured, and they've got all these machines where they're recording stuff and everything. And I was very particular about something I wanted in the scene. I can't remember what it was now, but you're under pressure. You're doing it as quickly as you possibly can. And turned up, and we were ready, and something very specific that I asked for that I thought was very important hadn't made it. Now, in fairness to set dresses and things like that, I had 90% of what I wanted. It was that extra 10% that I thought was important. So I was being a bit grumbly. And Ian came up to me and he said, "What's the matter with you? Look around. You're never going to get this again. It's Roy Scheider, James Fox." And he said, named everybody on the set. And I went, oh, okay, let's go.
Well, I want to ask you about, those control room scenes. Scott and I, we watch a different spy movie every week. We see a lot of control rooms, and often these scenes can be just death on screen. Like, they are so slow and it's just exposition. But one thing I really admired about Russia House was how you made those scenes just feel alive. And I'm just curious, what was the secret to achieving that?
The actors are very good, and we spoke about it's the clash of personalities that's going on in that particular scene. So it's not just empty of substance. It's not just they're recording that's happening over there, and also there's a lot of time zones at work, believe it or not, in that. So you've got personal interaction, people not agreeing with one another, and it's part of one of the themes of the film of some of the stupidity of spying, and the politics of it within itself, not outside itself. And then you've got the event that's happening outside. So, for instance, if you take, and I think that's the scene that, from memory, if you take this where Sean and Michelle are having a conversation up in the bell tower in the city of churches, there's 5 different time zones going on there. There's the present tense. There's the present tense, which is a different time for the spies. There's the fact that something's 2 days before. There's the people who are filming them. So you've sort of, and you're cutting between all these, but you're making it seem like it's just one continuous time, really, and it kind of is, because by the time that in those days, by the time the tape got back, to the spy area, and they were able to play them and assess them, and yet they needed to talk to the people in their present tense. You know what I mean? So that that kind of stuff, it just keeps you on your toes, really. And the same thing was happening with lenses, so that you were in with them in the scene, moving around them, and what was going on was a very personal thing between them. You've got the most extraordinary location of the city of churches, where no one's been allowed to film before. So, and then you've got somebody standing off with you're using long lenses to give that feeling that this is all being looked at from outside, from various angles. Then you've got the people listening, but the people listening are 2 days later. But you've got somebody there also record, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go on.
Mm-hmm.
A little complicated, but
well, no, but this just goes to show the level of depth that went into putting this film together, and I think we spent a lot of time just talking about that and sort of crediting it. What we took from it as well was clearly a lot of craft went into it, and I wanted to talk about sort of. You mentioned shooting in Russia. You said a little bit about it, but what was that actually like? I think it was the first Western, like Hollywood film to shoot in Russia post, communism falling, basically. What was that process like? Was there obstacles you had to overcome? How did it all come together?
the people who connected us, Alem Klimov was the guy. He was a great director himself. And then we ended up with Nikita Mikhailkov's production group. And none of them had kind of worked in the way that we worked. We really changed the systems of how they did things. If they were laying tracks, it would take an exceptionally long time, whereas we do it in 20 minutes. So we had to bring them along with us, which they were willing and enthusiastic to do, but it took a lot of work. There was no food, Russia was in a destitute state. Fortunately for us, because of Alam Klimov, Gorbachev wanted this as an experiment, one of the first official experiments. So we got cooperation like you wouldn't believe. We had military stopping traffic and all of that stuff. So on one hand, things were made easier for us and permitted us to do some of the things we did. On the other hand, there was no food. So we had to bring in all our own food and water for breakfast and lunch, basically. At night, you were on your own. The hotel accommodation, we were split on different sides of Moscow, which did not make things easy. And then the bulk of the crew were at a hotel called the Hotel Russia, which is right across from, or right on Red Square. But, you know, it was not exactly the cleanest or most efficient hotel, or comfortable. But they were going home at night, getting thrown out of their rooms because, like in Russia, you get sort of, in those days, if you wanted to come to Russia, you got billeted. You might be sleeping in rooms with strangers, and you were turfed out after one night or two nights or something, made to move on. So the crew were going home at night and getting thrown out of their rooms, you know. So we had people doing nothing but getting them back in rooms and stuff. So we had those kind of inconveniences. Like when we took all the equipment and the food and all that sort of stuff in, we had to go in a convoy from Finland, and no truck was allowed to be more than a yard apart from another truck because of pirating.
Wow.
So, you know, there was some risks. There was a guy doing our currency who was an Iranian Russian or something. And then after we left, we heard that he was found floating down a river. So there was odd stuff going on. You know, I went for a few car rides with people up back alleys, being told certain things I could do and couldn't do. And it was a shambolic time. But that's what we hoped to also, that's kind of what we hoped to capture, because, you know, that's what Le Carré was writing about. It was a pretty tough road. But shortly after that, boy, did it go wild. We were shooting and we hadn't, I was using my money and my credit card, and so was my fellow producer, and we thought it's time MGM started coughing up. This was earlier in pre-production, and we said, well, let's ring. Well, you couldn't ring. The deal was, if you were ringing internationally, you booked a call, the Bushka downstairs, you know, and it'd be a couple of days before you got it. And I said, well, we can't do that. We've got to get this happening right now. So I went down and sat down and worked my so-called charm on the babushka. You know, they're tough women. And she said, all right, 20 seconds. I said, what? She said, basically, you want it or you don't want it? 20 seconds. I said, okay, right. Thank you. Here's the number. Ran upstairs, sat down. The producer, the other producer, and the production supervisor, we sat down and we wrote what we would say in 20 seconds. Right? So we're sitting there ready to go. And we rehearsed it again, ready to go. And the call wasn't coming through. So I rang downstairs and she said, yes, 20 seconds. I said, no, we know that. No, 20 seconds. She meant the 22nd of the month, which was 3 days' time.
Right.
Oh no.
Wow. Well, I would just love to know about, you have some amazing locations in this movie. If you had any favorites to shoot in.
I think the city of Churches was certainly the most glamorous. Actually, yes, but some of it, like where the Winter Palace is, there's a big military building. There's a big square, and uh, you can't get the scale of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not tall towers, a great spread of buildings, and you stand there and it just hits you, the power of this square. But try and get that on film. You can't. You can do it with a bit of movement and stuff. You can get somewhere near it, but you can't actually get the full impact. And I found that a few times. The scale of Russia was pretty extraordinary. The highways going through the city, eight lanes on each direction. And there's a policeman standing on the edge of this wide highway, right? And he's got a stick, not much bigger than this,
Right.
and it's got black and white, black and white, black and white around it, right? And you say, well, we need to get to the center of the road. He goes, fine. He just steps out and he goes, and the traffic stands right up on his nose. Just go, wallop, stop. You go, oh, I like this. That's you sort of think, wow, what kind of control is that? It's it was pretty extraordinary. It was pretty extraordinary to be there, watching Gorbachev go around to a country, and then 2 days later they'd say the country's no longer in the Soviet Union. Then he'd go to another country. So just to witness all that while being there was absolutely extraordinary. And all of that helps you get that atmosphere. And, like one of the big things in the film, is where do people get their food? You'd be driving around and there'd be a pile of shoes on a traffic island. And in another area, there'd be a pile of cabbages. And the people used to go and fill their bags up. You'll notice they all carry bags during the film, which LeCarre wrote about, Then what they do is they go home at night and they swap. You get shoes, you give me cabbage, you give me, carrots or something like that. And when we were surveying, we went into people's apartments, and there'd be 5 stoves in the kitchen, but one stove for each person, and so whole families were living in one room. And twice I made the mistake of looking at a painting on the wall, going, "Oh, gee, that's really nice." I was trying to make everybody feel comfortable. The next thing I know, I've got the painting. I go, no, no, no. They go, you can't refuse it. You can't. If they give you something, it means you're connected for life. So you can't I can't take it. But it's like, so I'd have to take the painting. There was a little alabaster egg that I admired somewhere. So I stopped admiring things. It was quite an experience.
When we spoke to Ian about the actual practicalities of shooting in Russia, he mentioned some problems with shooting like crowd scenes because of like the people would crowd around the stars to see people like Sean Connery and stuff like that, and having to sort of go somewhat guerrilla and just basically take a camera and run through the streets to get shots. Do you have any memory of that sort of stuff and sort of any problems you had to overcome?
Sure. You've got to, we had extras, so you could fill the foreground with that, and then try and put the camera somewhere that anybody who's not part of the thing wouldn't know they were being filmed. Those are the days of public domain, where you could film if people will happen to be where you were. That's tough luck. You know, you're in our film. Can't do that anymore, which is a real pain.
And I would love to know, you talk about kind of the crowd scenes. What was the most difficult sequence to shoot for the movie?
Possibly the scene where Sean is actually going to have this meeting, which is exceptionally dangerous, and he walks through a whole area and then crosses in the traffic and walks down the road and into the house.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting the right mood. One of the big things in the film is the music.
Yeah.
I have a theory that music should not just be there to influence your emotions, or music is there to give you a dimension that you can't otherwise get. And that scene in particular works so incredibly well because of the beautiful theme that Jerry Goldsmith did. It was just extraordinary. And you'll hear it imitated again and again and again in spy movies. It had just that right amount of menace, romance, everything, because he was really sacrificing, or prepared to sacrifice himself. So
I don't think Jerry Goldsmith has ever quite let me down when it comes to scores. The man, left quite the legacy when it comes to music. I want to ask about, because I think our listeners would be very keen to know Sean Connery himself, what it was like to work with the man. It's quite a legend in spy circles for some obvious reasons. But from your perspective, what was it like to work with Sean?
We had a great time. We have the same lawyer, and the lawyer said, you're going to be one of the only directors Sean hasn't sued. And I know he had a great time because his wife kept telling my wife, because I was really leaning on him to lose the shell, to bring out the human side of himself, of the possible frailties here and there. So that involved digging deep and pushing hard, and he just loved it. He thought that was great because, a lot of people just won't do that. They're working with a high-powered actor, and sometimes they may not be all that good at what they do. So the actor is protecting themselves. They're giving a performance that can't be screwed with, Whereas if they can trust you, they will push the envelope. They will go further, knowing that they can trust you to hold back, get them to hold back once they've gone too far, And that's not just on the set, that's in editing as well. So then that makes them feel very comfortable, and they can take chances, and they can, come up with better work, basically. The one thing he wasn't too good at was irony. Now, I know that's sort of hard to believe from James Bond.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ironic lines. But there was a couple of situations. One of them was when he's standing on the bridge. We've walked through some buildings, and he's standing on the bridge, and a tout comes up to him and goes, "You get lost?" And Sean's line is, "That's a good idea. Why don't you try it?" Right? And Sean just couldn't get it. He said, I wouldn't do that. I'd say, piss off or I'll kick you up the bum. And I said, well, that's a fun line, but not as good as this one. Right? Anyway, we talked about it. He didn't get it. I said, all right, well, you never give actors a line reading. That's not a good idea. But we agreed that maybe in this case, to do a line reading. So I said, well, maybe if you say it this way. But I had the crew all lined up. So I said, right, I'll try it. So he did the line and I had the whole crew laugh. And he went, yeah, okay. But I mean, he was really, really good. They both were. Oh, actually, everyone was. And the wildest one, of course, was Klaus Maria Brandau. Klaus Maria Brandau was married to a very talented director. And he's a bit of Jack the Lad. But he was very worried that she'd gone into Hungary to do something and he hadn't heard from her for a while, and that disturbed him. She should be, he wondered whether he'd done something wrong or she was doing something wrong, or and he came to me on the Friday night and said, I'm going to Hungary. I'll be back for Monday morning. I said, well, really? How the hell are you going to do that? Particularly in those days. He said, I'll do it. Don't you worry. I'll guarantee I'll be back, for the call Monday morning. And off he went on the Friday night. He hitched rides with pilots. He did everything. He went to Hungary, caught up with his wife, and he was back at 5 a.m. on the Monday morning. God, that's such a European thing, they're very resourceful. He was great. He was also a lot of fun to work with. We had a lot of. It was an extraordinary group who all enjoyed working together, and when we ended up in Canada to shoot the CIA headquarters or wherever scene anyway. We would go to a restaurant at night, and Sean Connery was a musicals fan, as was the others. John Mahoney knew all the words to all the songs, so he would feed us the lines before we sang it. So a table of like 12 of these very famous people singing musicals in a Vancouver restaurant attracted a fair amount of attention. So I didn't see the restaurant filling up. It was really good.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the spy game, requires considerable resources. Whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair, we're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the SpyHards Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
Call me Pliskin. This week, Scott, we are going to look at the 1981 John Carpenter classic, Escape from New York. It's going to be number 1.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true spy hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx.
I would love to know, in 2007, I believe, was it you served as the chairman of the jury of the Moscow International Film Festival? Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
I would love to know just how the place had changed. Like, did you really notice a drastic change in 2007 versus 1990, or no?
Unbelievable. And actually, there's a very weird thing. We were driving through on the way to our hotel, and I looked across, and Tom Stoppard was coming out of a theatre.
Oh, wow.
He was rehearsing his three-play theatre piece, which is I think it's a 9-hour play. He was rehearsing it in Russia, in Russian, and he was walking out just as we were passing. So you can imagine the yelling and screaming that went on. But they spent. I mean, there was one restaurant basically that anyone went to when we were there, and there was one Italian restaurant on a barge that started up just before we left there when we were shooting. Now the roads were covered in advertising signs, even banners across the roads, like banner after banner after banner, all advertising. Restaurants had proliferated, and they'd spent millions on the decor. And all the designer shops, from cars to clothes and everything were there. But on the side of the road, there were still people selling strawberries, because that's how they got paid. They picked strawberries. They were allowed to take a certain amount, and then they had to go and sell them on the roadside. So the underbelly of all that affluence was probably worse than it was in a way. And all the babushkas who had these, a place to live, a lot of them were chucked out onto the streets so people could make money out of selling the apartments and stuff like that. So there was an extreme contrast in the wealth and the display of it, and the poverty of probably the bulk of people. It was pretty extraordinary.
And I suppose looking back on the Russia House, and I'm glad we've covered it, and I'm glad we enjoyed the film. But from your point of view, did you enjoy the process of making the film, and what are your thoughts on sort of the finished product? I should say.
I loved it. It was great. It was an extraordinary experience, to be in Russia at that time when the wall was coming down, and everything was changing. Despite all the privation and hardship, it's just an extraordinary experience. And then to go to Portugal after it, which weirdly enough, Portugal was at that time kind of a city halfway between capitalism and not communism, but sort of that kind of thing. And then go to Canada, plus shooting in London, and with when you get into those situations, if you've got a good crew, you become incredibly close and dependent on one another. And if they're all inventive people, it's great. And then if the actors pick up on that, because you create a situation where they can do what they do in otherwise might be very, very difficult circumstances. But and then to work with great actors, it's just fantastic. So I thoroughly enjoyed the process. There was an interesting thing when the film came out, when it went into video stores. And apparently, if they put the film in the romance section of a video store, it went gangbusters. If they put it in the spy section, it didn't go so well.
Right.
And it's kind of, I guess, it's sort of, if you go and go, oh, okay, this will be romantic, Michelle and Sean, and then you get all this extra dimension of humanity and life in different places and spying. But if you put it in the spy thing, it's not conventionally a spy thing. It's not like the Ipcrest file, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on. It's a movie. It's a movie in a way that's not delivering on the normal promise of a spy film, and I think that's what I'm proudest of. But it probably cost us some money.
I can kind of see why though, because when you think of like spy movies, like so many of the posters play up kind of the action or the violence aspect. Whether it's James Bond, some of those Harry Palmers, across the board really to this day. And I would have to imagine, I know the poster of Russia House quite well, and it does not look like that type of movie. So people who are looking for spy things are going to be more likely to grab the one that looks like a traditional spy film. But you're right. Yeah, you put that in romance, like it has a certain pedigree that comes across just in the image of the poster.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exotic locations, two stars reaching out for one another across, different worlds. I think it's great, and the tension is more, in a way, more imagined. You don't see a lot of action stuff in the conventional way.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Connery on the upswing, post the Untouchables and stuff like that as well. This is Connery like getting his second wind, basically. So it's maybe moving to the romance section may have just done the trick. And I suppose the last question I had for you, Fred, in terms of the Russia House is, what is your favorite moment from the film you put together when you look back on it?
Well, actually, weirdly enough, it's where Sean is in the hallway at Michelle's house, and her dad is playing the piano and trying to command his attention, and keeps talking to him in a language that Sean is not familiar with, of course. And she's in the kitchen getting dinner ready, and he just wants to be down in the kitchen with her, but he's feeling obligated to, talk to her dad. And we had the set designed. You'll never notice it on film, but if it was a conventional hallway, you'd never be able to really see both properly. So the set's actually got twists and bends in it, and so that you can look from one to the other and see in a way that you wouldn't in a conventional hall. But it looks like it doesn't. You wouldn't know that. And getting Sean to dig deep and open up and do the romantic side of it was, yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed that. And funnily enough, it's a scene that Tom Stoppard hates the most, because he wanted them sitting on a bed, and she was reading something to him, or vice versa. But I liked the push and pull of it, kind of having to be here, wanting to be there, trying to be there, but at the same time also faltering in saying what you really want to say to her. So it kind of made it wonderfully complicated.
Listening to you talk about, working with Michelle or Sean, I find it very interesting just hearing you talk about the dynamics of getting across, dramatic performance. And also, when I watch Russia House, it's very they feel like intimate performances. They don't feel like kind of glossy movie star performances. And I would say the same with Meryl Streep in A Cry in the Dark. But there's this interesting dichotomy in your work where then I am very interested then to know just a little bit about when you work with comedians, when you're working with, whether it's the cast of Fierce Creatures or Steve Martin in Roxanne, and just your approach to comedy, because so much of what you're talking about, it feels like very grounded in drama. I would just like to know about your comedy perspective.
A lot of people make the mistake of thinking comedy and drama are different. But in fact, they both rely on timing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes that's forgotten in drama. And, it's very obviously important. But one of the differences is in a way, comedy makes you be more conventional in how you cover it, because often you've got to see 5 or 6 things in the scene, and they've got to be very clear, because that's where the comedy is. This happens to that, happens to that. You need to see it all. So, and frequently there's only one place you can see it all. So it eliminates sometimes where you might want to make a movement or add something extra visually. No. Set the scene up so that what's happening is clear, every bit of it. There's a scene where in Roxanne where the fire truck comes out and roars down the hill, and of course all the stuff falls off it. Well, we first set up the shot. You're looking. You want to get the mountains in the distance. You want to, beautiful shot. The truck comes out, all the stuff comes off. You can't see it because it's going downhill. So that means you've got to put the camera up at a level. So at first it kind of annoyed me a bit because it makes it more conventional, but then learn from it, because, the same thing frequently should be at work in drama. The thing about comedy is don't play the comedy, play the scene for real. Sometimes you notch it up. Steve and I had a thing we said, is this notch 1 or notch 2? Like sometimes you just notch it up a little bit without playing the comedy, but so that when you're doing the stuff where he's got to profess his love, you got to buy it, you got to believe it. So if he's playing like the goof all the time, you're not going to buy that much. So just don't play actually both comedy and drama inform one another as far as I'm concerned.
Interesting.
And you see some people, I won't name names, but you see some people who are not as good at comedy as they are at other things, because they're playing the damn comedy instead of just letting it be found and be discovered.
And you directed a number of comedies. I'm curious, when you look at your work, which one are you the most proud of, or the one that you kind of go like, that's the one I feel like I nailed it the most?
Oh, I don't know. People wouldn't let me do comedy. They wouldn't give me. It took ages. It used to frustrate my agents, and in fact, I had actors wanting me to do it. And I used to say, "Well, geez, haven't you seen Jimmy Blacksmith? It's a barrel of laughs." They just weren't going to give me a comedy. But actually Dan Melnick and Steve Martin, and mostly Steve Martin, he didn't want a comedy director for Roxanne. And that's the one that enabled me to break through and do that. But yeah, which is, I don't know.
That's fair.
I obviously, I think the most complete one is Roxanne.
Right.
In Fierce Creatures, I just came in to fix it up. I reshot about a third of it and re-edited the whole thing, and then they sort of changed some of it back. And I loved IQ. I thought that was with like Walter Matthau playing Einstein, unreal.
Yeah.
The guy's 6 foot something, Einstein's 4 foot something. And yet, Walter Matthau made himself. Just, I loved all that with those guys. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, this question, I'll start to wrap this up. I've got sort of 2 questions left for you, Fred. This one might be a bit of a tricky one, but I like to ask specifically directors when I have them on the show.
You remind me of when I was shooting a scene with all the Inuits in Iceman. Without realizing it, we do a take and I go, that's right. And I go, okay, one more. I kept saying, okay,
Yeah, don't worry. I'll sneak 2 more questions in before the end. You'll never know it hit you. I'm used
one
to
of the
that.
indigenous people said, "You said one more 10 times." What does one more mean? Sorry.
we, we've had notes in the past of when I've said to people, "Oh, I've got 2 more questions." It's been 3, and then the listeners have been like, "Hey, you asked 3 instead of 2, Scott." If I think of a question, I'll ask. But okay, I have 2 questions for you, Fred. Firstly, is there a piece of work from your filmography that you really love that you think didn't get the love it deserved that people should go and check out after listening to this?
Yeah, Last Orders. It got extremely badly distributed,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a number of reasons. Stupid distribution probably is the most difficult area of film, and if film companies are going through troubles like being taken over or being sold, or um, 6 Degrees of Separation enjoys a good reputation, but in fact it was thrown to the wolves
Mm-hmm.
because MGM was being taken over. Arnaud Milchan had foreign rights, but for TV, so he didn't release it properly in cinemas or spend the money on that. There's a few where distribution has buried them, and actually Barbarossa got deliberately buried, because the company Universal that distributed it had distributed Honeysuckle Rose with Willie Nelson in it, and it hasn't done well, so they didn't want to take the chance, which was pretty weird, really.
It's funny you should mention Last Orders because it stars, Harry Palmer himself, Mr. Michael Caine. So
Exactly.
little bit of bringing it full circle there. I like that, Fred. Well done. We'll put links to that in our show notes below. People can go find that on streaming, I believe. And last but not least, and this question has been asked to literally everyone who we've had on the show. It's a big question. Fred Schepisi, what is your favorite spy movie of all time?
Probably The Ipcress File.
I had a feeling you might say that.
Bring it full circle.
There
Was
it
The
is.
Long Goodbye a spy movie?
It has elements, yeah.
I mean, the end shot in that of Bob Hoskins, just watching his face go through all the possibilities of what was going to happen to him was fantastic.
Mm.
No, I'll go with The Ipcress File.
I think a lot of people listening to this just cheered that you said that because it's a big film with a lot of our listeners. So I'm sure they're all glad you picked it.
Good. Okay.
But I think all that's left to say is I'll stick to my 2 questions. I'll keep my word. I want to thank you, firstly, for The Russia House as a film. We had a wonderful time talking about it, and I think more people should be checking it out. So I hope they do from listening to this. And I want to thank you, Fred, for your time. It's been more than insightful. It's been invaluable talking to you about this film.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for your time, Fred, and stay well.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Well, there you go, folks. That was our chat with Mr. Fred Schepisi, and what a chat it was. I want to thank Fred for taking the time to take us through his journey with the Russia House. We learned a lot about the film, a lot of good stories there, but Cam, what was a highlight for you?
Well, honestly, like when it comes to this interview, and this isn't often the case, but so many stories about shooting on location in Russia. And I mean, location work is a big part of movie making, but it doesn't, at least in our experience doing these interviews, it doesn't kind of like hang over the entire project in such a profound way, where we had so many stories about, working with a Soviet crew. As we talked about, like a significant portion of the crew had to be of Soviet background just because of shooting in Moscow. And then also just like even the experiences of where they were living, the hotels they were staying at, the complications when it came to shooting, whether it was locations or just the locals, all of that sort of storytelling that Fred brought to this episode, I think really summed up the experience of that movie in a way that, frankly, I just did not expect going into the interview.
No, nor I. And I just think, it's in the title of the book / film, The Russia House. Russia itself is an important component in the story. And I think the film, and we said it in the review, is very successful in making Russia kind of a character within of itself. And that is mostly down to the work of Fred and Ian and the rest of the crew. And it was lovely to hear just how involved that shoot was, how much work went into it. Because, this film didn't get lauded when it came out. It wasn't a high box office earner, but it actually had some major milestones, like the first Hollywood film to shoot in Russia post, the fall of the Berlin Wall, basically. It's a big thing. It was a test, like Gorbachev's test to see if films could shoot there. A lot was riding on this film, and just hearing like the sort of level of poverty in the country at the time, and what the cast and crew had to sort of, I say deal with, because they were living a life of luxury in comparison to what was going on in Russia, but to sort of live in that world for that time, it must have been quite scary at times.
Yeah, it's interesting in that it was probably like a real bonding experience for that crew,
Mm.
but also for many like a draw for that job, like what made that movie so appealing to such a pretty crackerjack collection of cast members there when you start going down the list. And I mean, there would have been that sort of like, wow, we're going to shoot this movie in Russia. That sounds like an experience I want to have. And it seemed like there was some very adventurous people attached to this movie. And I mean, he was telling the story about Klaus Maria Brandauer, about heading off to Hungary and making it back on time. Like, it just feels like this was the type of shoot where there was just so many stories that could come out of it, both in front of and, away from the set. But I do feel like we were robbed, Scott. I feel like we were robbed of like the making of documentary of Russia House, like having a documentary crew on the set shooting this over the course of the production, kind of with the way they did with like Burden of Dreams with the Werner Herzog movie. Something like that would have been incredible. Or Hearts of Darkness about the making of Apocalypse Now. Like, I want my documentary about the making of Russia House.
And it probably would have happened if the film had had a better reception, or some sort of retrospective at least. But I guess that's kind of what we're doing here. We have 2 SpyMaster interviews for the film, and if anyone is looking to sort of look into this film in the future, they'll have this as a resource for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, so much detail in this interview that it's the type of interview you dream of, because you just hope you're going to get, filmmakers who can come on and just give you this like real overview with all these like little details that just feel so specific to the experience. And that was just consistent throughout this entire chat.
And sort of spinning off from your point there, Cam, one of my highlights was just sort of hearing about the casting process. Now, Sean was attached very early on, but just hearing a couple of stories about working with Sean, the idea of Sean and the crew singing songs in Vancouver when they were shooting there.
Yeah.
Just know that your city was very cool for a brief period of time.
I was not at the place to be when I was 10 years old.
Apparently not. But we also got like an idea of an alternative casting for Michelle Pfeiffer's character as well. Originally, they were going to go with an actual Russian local, but eventually they wanted to go more Hollywood with it because the powers that be wanted someone a bit more recognizable to Western audiences, which is completely understandable for that sort of period of time. And they were taking quite a punt on this film in several different perspectives. But one thing that jumped out for me was actually just hearing the story of how on earth Ken Russell got involved with this film.
Yes, this was such a cool question to ask, Sod. I'm so glad you had it. And I also had that one underlined on my list because I was fascinated to know how Ken Russell wound up in this movie. He's so memorable with his like surveillance bingo game he has going on. And to hear that he was kind of like messing with Fred and the crew by switching his socks back and forth, that just sounds like kind of what I expect from Ken Russell.
Yeah, that does sound very on point from the man who made $1 Billion Brain. And what was that musical film he made?
Tommy?
Yeah, that's very on brand for Tommy. I could just see him messing around with continuity and like changing his uniform and stuff between shots just to annoy people, for sure.
Yeah, I am just so fascinated about the like spy connections we find consistently, and the idea of, as you said, billion-dollar brain, the director of that film winding up in the Russia house. Like, huh?
Well, yeah, we spoke a lot about it in the review, but it's nice to finally hear it from the man himself as to how and why that happened. But Cam, another highlight from you?
One thing I thought was really interesting was to hear him talk about the control room sequence. And when you have those actors in that set, you know, JT Walsh, Scheider, this whole collection, Mahoney, you have this whole collection of character actors. And Scott, you and I have seen, as I mentioned in the interview, many scenes of great actors in a room where it is just, you know, the air is let out of that room.
Mm-hmm.
And to hear him talk so passionately about how you make that happen and how the movie's working with multiple time zones and all of that sort of thing was just a great technical breakdown as to why those scenes in particular stand out so much.
Yeah, it really goes to show the level of craft that goes into making these films sometimes. And the care and attention that this film got, I think, shone through just from hearing from Fred. He clearly cared about adding more dimension and layers to a scene that could have been purely expository in nature and just been, you know, one wide shot as men exchange lines with each other. And I'm sure a lesser skilled director would have shot it exactly that way. But hearing Fred sort of put together the scene in different timelines he was talking about and stuff just added dimension to a scene. Yeah, I compare this in a lot of ways to sort of Spy Game, for instance, where a lot of ballroom scenes could seem boring. But the cinematography is so rich in that film, it seems dramatic and exciting. This has added sort of dimensions and tensions in different ways. But again, it goes to show the level of passion that Fred put into making this scene and, I would say, this film.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is him coming off of A Cry in the Dark, which he directed Meryl Streep to an Oscar nomination for her performance in that movie. So it's someone who has, I think, a very strong understanding of working with very capable actors. And, you know, the sense that, like, every scene in this movie, it feels like you really have someone who understands how to get the best out of his actors in a way that doesn't feel kind of like synthetic, like kind of like Hollywood star-studded blockbuster kind of stuff. Like it feels like deep character work, and it's just really impressive when you see the movie.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to just quickly touch on just how happy I am with the interview itself, and sort of the caliber of people we've been speaking to recently. You know, it's really been adding to my knowledge of films, and I think I've come out of this process of critically analyzing the Russia House and sort of speaking to people that made it with a much higher regard for the film itself. I think just one viewing of the film compared to two viewings and these two interviews have changed my perspective on the film almost entirely.
No, I know exactly what you mean, Scott, and I felt that through a lot of our interviews, where whether we like the movie or not, when we actually listen to filmmakers talk about it and break them down to nuts and bolts, it was often just absolutely fascinating to hear the level of commitment they had to telling these stories. And we have another one in the bank that's going to be coming out a little further down the road, guys, that is also incredibly insightful about a pretty popular spy film that I think you're going to enjoy. And it's like these types of interviews are what really get me excited about, you know, this whole kind of series we do on SpyHards.
It's also important to note, Cam, this is the 50th SpyMaster interview we've ever done.
Yeah.
50! That's crazy.
How did we get here, Scott?
I don't know. A wing and a prayer. It's I am forever grateful and forever confused that people are gracious enough to give us their time for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and willing to be so open with their experiences and just sharing that. Yeah.
I know. I did want to add one last thing before we wrap up. When we ended this interview, I immediately hung my head in shame because I realized I hadn't asked a question I should have asked.
Okay.
I wanted to know, was that really Sean Connery playing the comb?
Well, we all have regrets in life, and that may be your biggest one now going forward.
That will be the albatross. The burden I bear. But on a lighter note, Cam, I guess it goes to you now, sir. What are we talking about next week?
Yes, we are tackling the first in a franchise. We are going to look at the Charles Bronson 1970s thriller, The Mechanic. Of course, our entry point to tackle the Jason Statham films from a couple decades later. And I think we're going to be looking at these the same way we looked at The Day of the Jackal, which is, does this Hitman series warrant recognition in the spy genre? We'll decide next week.
Yes, we are going to put it to the test. We're going to see if The Mechanic passes its MOT, which I realize is a very British joke because they don't have MOTs in different countries around the world. But all you British people are very much laughing right now. Either with me or at me, you're still laughing.
I don't get it, but yes.
No. Yeah. Well, there you go, folks. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to watch the original version of The Mechanic from 1972. And if you like what you heard on the show this week, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, you'll find me mixing up Ken Russell's socks.